Oh, nice. Yeah.
What is life about if he's I don't know it anymore. It's like too long, man.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along, and hello to everybody joining us online. I'll have a great pleasure of introducing Dr Annelie Harvey from Anna New Harvey University, who's the head of department there, and deputy head of department there, and her area of expertise is social justice. So over to you, and thanks again for coming.
Hey, hello everybody, thank you for having me, and thank you for staying. I know it's 5 PM on a Wednesday at the end of the day, so I'm glad to see some of you here, so thank you for coming. I'm Dr Annelie Harvey from Anna New Harvey, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my research that I conducted during my PhD with some colleagues, and also some research around that topic to give you a bit of an overview. I'm happy to take questions as we go along, or save them to the end, it's completely up to you. But hopefully I kind of pitch this at the right level so I don't lose anybody, but if I do, just let me know. So, before I start getting into the topic, I really wanted to start off by giving you an outline of the theory, and it's the belief in a just world theory. And the reason I want to do that is because it really underlies everything I'm going to say. So I want to give you an overview of the theoretical context. So the belief in just world theory was first proposed by Mel Lerner back in the 60s, really, and conceptualised and developed in the 80s. And the general principle is that we all believe that the world is a fair and just place. So we all are married to the idea that everybody gets what they deserve. So good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That's the general theory. You'd be forgiven to thinking that the world isn't just, it isn't fair. You probably don't have to look very far or think very hard to find instances of injustice where people have bad events and misfortunes before them that are considered undeserved. But what Lerner would argue is that although you might think that and have that attitude explicitly, we all behave in a way as if we believe in a just world. Lerner says that if we didn't believe in a just world, we would actually act as if we were in a jungle and could just take what we could get when we could get it. So, for example, I can see perhaps there's a number of students in the audience. If I were to tell you that it doesn't matter how much effort you put into your degree, you aren't going to get a deserved grade at the end, there would be no motivation for engaging in your course. And of course that isn't the case. But the same if you were working in a job, if you were told that your pay packet wasn't deserved or guaranteed at the end of the month, there'd be a lack of motivation to go to work perhaps. So believing in a just world is a bit larger than just believing in fairness. It's believing in deservingness and the ability to delay gratification. The ability to believe that deserved, longer, delayed rewards are going to happen. They are promised, and there's that predictability in the world. So if we were to suspend that belief and suspend that what we do now doesn't have consequences, or we're not going to get our deserved outcomes in the end, then perhaps we wouldn't abide by our social norms and perhaps live in this kind of jungle world that Lerner says we would. So in summary, we start off as children very much living in this jungle world, but as we develop something called a personal contract. And that's the ability to delay gratification and to trust in deservedness and trust that we will get deserved rewards if we're a good person. And children also often taught and culturalised that if they're naughty, there will be consequences also. So there's this matching between your behaviour and outcomes. And this leads us to believe in a just world, and as we get older, this is really what functions us in society to believe and motivate us to pursue long-term goals and investments. However, we do not have to look very far to find instances of injustice. So I'm going to pick up some articles that I've noticed in the media the last couple of months that really demonstrate that the world isn't a fair and just place, and could quite rationally pose a threat to our belief in a just world. We're believing that everybody gets outcomes that are deserved. But you may have heard of this story last month. Bad things happen to people that don't deserve it all the time. So this is a story of Thomas Jones, who was an 18-year-old going off to university and tragically lost his life in Precious Week. This seems really undeserved. He's just starting his life and just starting university and wasn't able to carry on that. More recently, you might have heard about the wildfires in California. A lot of people have lost their homes, all their belongings, and even their lives. Again, it's very hard to come up with a rationale as to why these people deserved such a misfortune to befall them. This is a bit of an older story, but I think this really illustrates a complete contradiction of the belief in a just world theory. This was last year. You may have heard about this on the news, but a family took in a homeless individual and provided support, housing, clothing, took them in as part of the family. And unfortunately, the individual that they took into their home and made welcome actually murdered 2 members of the family. So this is a real instance of arguably good people doing nice, good things and receiving a bad outcome. A real contradiction to the belief in just world theory. So we've kind of got a bit of odds here. On the one hand, we have this fundamental belief that we want to believe the world is fair and just, and people get what they deserve, so we can get what we deserve, so we can go about our daily lives. But we can look at the media and have instances of injustice where we have good people receiving bad outcomes. And I like to think this is a kind of scales, and when we don't have a good or a bad synergy, we have a bit of an imbalance. So here we have a threat to our belief in a just world when we read about all these horrible things happening to people. So what Lerner proposed is that we can engage in different ways or respond in different ways to these types of stories to restore a sense of justice. So this is my kind of visual diagram to kind of explain this process. So we start off at the top there, having this devotion and belief in a just world. That's what really underpins our day-to-day activities. Then we're faced with instances of injustice, such like those in the media we've just been discussing. So in response, we can engage in a number of strategies or reactions to justice. And these are different ways that we can comprehend, think, act, or behave to rectify this injustice in some way, to get us back to maintaining that belief in a just world. Now, there's lots of different reactions, some that Lerner originally proposed and some that have been developed since. And I'm mainly just going to talk about one today, which is victim derogation. The main reason for that is because if anybody's heard of belief in a just world theory before, you may also have heard of victim derogation. The two seem to come hand in hand. Victim derogation essentially means devaluing a victim, so devaluing somebody's character. And victim derogation is a strategy that can restore a sense of injustice and balance these scales, because instead of thinking about a good person receiving a bad outcome, we're changing how we perceive an individual, devaluing their character to be less of a good person, i.e. a bad person. So the bad outcome that's occurring to that person is no longer at odds with belief in a just world theory. And perhaps there is a sense of justice if we think about the victim in a different way. Now, you would probably be again forgiven for thinking that actually who does this? Who actually devalues victims who have already gone through suffering and horrendous event? And I'm going to pull out a couple of examples just to show you where victim derogation can be observed. Some of you may have heard of or may remember the Hillsborough Disaster, which was in the 1980s. This was a tragic event in a football stadium where a number of spectators lost their lives from crowding and being essentially crushed in the football stadium. So it was a real tragic event at the time. And this headline from the news, the Sun paper, so this is on the front page of the Sun at the time, really caused some outrage. Because if you read some of the lines here about the fans beating up police officers, etc., it's a bit of a smear campaign on the victims here and devaluing them as a cohort, I guess. So arguably what Lerner would say is this is an example of victim derogation. So instead of seeing these football fans as brothers and husbands and father figures and devoted football supporters, Sun's depicting them more as hooligans. And perhaps that's an easier pill to swallow for something bad has befallen arguably antisocial people rather than nice football supporters. Another example is from Kate Mccann. So Kate Mccann is the mother of Madeleine Mccann, who was a toddler who went missing over a decade ago. Kate Mccann is arguably a victim who's suffered child loss And you don't have to look very far on Twitter to find some really horrible comments about Kate Mccann. Here, there's lots of negativity from her appearance to her career to her mental state, arguably completely unrelated to her suffering. But again, perhaps this is victim derogation here. Perhaps it's easier for people to tar Kate Mccann as a horrible person that perhaps arguably deserved her unfortunate event, rather than as an upstanding member of the society and a middle-class doctor. I'm just going to talk about one more last example, because this was a headline that was on the news quite recently, you might have heard of. This was in America. On your left-hand side is the police officer who was going home. My understanding of the story is she lived in an apartment block and went either one floor up too high or too low, and thought she was in her home, but she was actually in her neighbour's home, and shot and killed her neighbour, thinking that they were an intruder in her home. What an unfortunate event. But why this story caught my attention was the following news stories around the victim. So there was news stories about the victim having found marijuana in his apartment. So there again, perhaps this has nothing to do with the case, but perhaps there's a bit of a tar and smear campaign going on the victim here to derogate and devalue their character. What's even more interesting is that people are really picking up on this kind of victim derogation in the media, on Twitter, in the media, and on BBC News, for example, which suggests that perhaps people aren't really very happy with this victim derogation. It's not really socially acceptable to think about this victim in negative terms when they've just lost their lives and pulling out unrelated negative characteristics about them. Okay. So that, in essence, is victim derogation and how it fits into the belief in a just world theory. So I'll take you back to the first conception of victim derogation, and that was through a classic study by Lerner and Simmons in the 1960s. So the way this study worked is that a number of participants were brought into a lecture hall, very much like this one, but one of them was a Confederate, so somebody that was part of the study and was aware of it. Participants were told that one of them would take part in a learning memory task, and the rest would be observers of behaviour. And it's not surprising that it was always the Confederate who was going to do this memory task. So this is actually a still from the memory task. You can see it's very, very 60s. So this was a Confederate who was taken out of the lecture hall and taken into another room. Participants were told they were watching a live CCTV video of this memory task. But in fact, it was, in actuality, it was pre-recorded. But they'd just been sitting next to this person in these same clothes, and they'd just left the room and they were now watching a video. Because it was the 60s, it was a shock experiment, and it was a fake shock experiment, but I've caught the screen clipping just here, so you can see that the participant is expressing quite a lot of pain and discomfort during this task. So arguably we have a sense of victimisation here, suffering, and participants are watching suffering happening to somebody quite close to them, another participant equally. Ooh, a little too fast. So after that suffering video, participants were in a number of different conditions. Again, it's an early social psychology experiment, so there's typically a number of conditions and very few participants. And I won't go through this in too much detail, but there's a number of conditions here, and some are constructed to pose more of a threat to our belief in a just world than others. So, for example, the first condition there is a midpoint condition. The participants were told, okay, we're halfway through the study, we've just watched some electric shocks, and there's going to be another round. This participant's going to engage in more suffering, have more electric shocks. So that would be quite threatening to you if you're about to watch this person being electrocuted again. Compared to the past event or the reward conditions, the participants were told that the study's over, the participant has been awarded, is now going to take part in a positive session where they're actually going to get money and rewards rather than electric shocks, or that actually this is an old video, it's happened in the past, the participant is fine and they received lots of money in compensation. Lerner and Simmons then measured victim derogation, and they did this via self-report. So they asked participants to then rate how they thought about that victim on a number of different personality scales. and also rate themselves on those personality scales. And they took a difference score between the two. So the difference meaning that the higher the score, participants saw the victim as more positive than themselves. The lower score, a negative score, participants saw the victim as worse or less positive than themselves, more negatively. And this is what they found. So you can see the conditions in red are those that I highlighted as being just well threatening. So the midpoint condition, the participants are about to suffer some more. They're going to endure more injustice. And you can see here that there's a real negative score here. So that's great victim derogation. Remember, a negative score is thinking about the victim more negatively than yourself. And in the green conditions, when we're told that the participant's going to be rewarded or that this is a past event, the participant's already been awarded, it's a lot more of a positive value of the victim. Not quite more positively than the self, but a lot more than those other conditions. So, we have this classic study by Lerner and Simmons that really put victim derogation on the map. And from that seminal study, there's been lots of research looking at victim derogation, primarily because it's quite counter-normative to secondarily victimise and perceive a victim negatively when they've just been suffering. That really has been quite a hot topic within this field of research. So, following Lerner and Simmons' study in the 60s, there was a flurry of studies that really replicated and used a similar design in the 70s and 80s, and then on and so forth. But ever since kind of more recent research, the results have been a lot more mixed, and I'll demonstrate that to you. So there's been a little bit of question around victim derogation, when and why it occurs and how. We thought to ourselves, perhaps it's a case that times have changed. Perhaps victim derogation is quite an outdated social attitude and reaction to victims. The examples I showed you at the start about the Hillsborough Sun article and Kate Mccann, perhaps they are outdated examples. And when I showed you the more recent article about Botham finding marijuana in his apartment, there's a big social backlash to that. It's being picked up in society. So perhaps it is that victim derogation isn't something that we recognise as a reaction anymore. It's not our go-to reaction, it's an outdated response. Elsewhere in psychology and social psychology, there has been parallel findings. So if any of you are psychologists or perhaps familiar with psychology, you might have heard of Ash's conformity study. There's been research to show that that effect has diluted as time has gone on. Perhaps we're becoming more aware of these phenomena. The other thing that came to our mind is perhaps it's the way victim derogation has been measured. So in the earlier studies, that Lerner study, it's very impactful because the participants are in a room, they're sitting next to this potential victim and are watching their suffering live on a video screen, ostensibly. More recent findings, actually, more recent studies tend to use less impactful stimuli. They seem to be more text-based, so vignette-based, which are much more hypothetical, perhaps not emotionally involving. And what Lerner would argue is that for someone's belief in a just world, their fundamental kind of commitment to the world to be threatened, you really need to be emotionally prompted and threatened. You need to be in the moment, and victim derogation needs to be kind of a natural response. When we're reading hypothetical scenario, it's quite easy just to disregard that or think of that as not threatening our belief in a just world because it's hypothetical or not true. So we have kind of two things going on here. So is it because time has changed and victim derogation no longer exists, or is it because of the way victim derogation has been measured? So my colleagues and I ran a meta-analysis where we looked at a whole load of studies, as you can see here, that measured victim derogation to see if there was an overall pattern or an overall effect. So this is a really scary looking slide, but I'll just talk you through it. At the top you can see Lerner and Simmons' original study, 1966, and then we have all of the studies that met our eligibility criteria in chronological order that measured victim derogation. The dotted line in the middle represents that there's no effect, for effect zero, a size of 0. Any blocks to the right-hand side show an overall effect of victim derogation. Any blocks to the other side show victim enhancement, so participants actually positively evaluating a victim more so than a non-victim. And you've got your confidence intervals there as well. So just by eyeballing this graph, you can hopefully appreciate that if you look at that first block of studies in the 1970s following Lerner and Simmons, there's a clear replication of victim derogation. But as we go through time, the results become a lot more mixed. They're a lot more around the centre 0 and even showing some effects of victim enhancement. Overall, we do have a very small effect, significant small effect for victim derogation, but the findings are very mixed here. So our take-home measure was that victim derogation does seem to exist overall. We look at all of the data and analyse it together, victim derogation. But we also found evidence for both of our theories of thinking. So derogation happens at a larger extent in earlier studies rather than more recent studies. I think you can see that quite clearly on the graph here. The earlier studies show more victim derogation than later studies. But also studies that have more impactful stimuli. So a lot of the learner work and the work at the start there used inaction scenarios, much like Lerner and Simmons, were much more emotionally involving, and they show evidence for victim derogation more than studies that show that use less impactful stimuli. So the two are confounded here, because not only was the early research impactful, but later research is less impactful. So it's hard to untie which of the reasons for these findings is true. So is it because there's an effect of time, or is it because there's an effect in the way we've measured victim derogation over time? So we've done some experimental work to try and get to the bottom and give you an answer. So we presented participants with a victimisation scenario via CCTV video that were available on YouTube, or we transcribed that same account into a scenario text-based form. So on the one hand, we've got a highly evolving, emotionally engaging instance of injustice via video, or the same event almost transcribed in text-based. So it's the same injustice, the same unfair, undeserved event is happening, but the way we're presenting it to participants differs, the mode of delivery. We also wanted to see if the way you measure victim derogation has an effect. So a lot of more recent studies measure victim derogation via these kind of self-report scales, which are very absolute. So on a scale of 0 to 10, for example, how positive do you rate this victim? But if you think back to Lerner's study, the measure of victim derogation was more of a relative measure. It was how participants rated the victim in comparison to themselves. So we included relative measures. So how would you rate this victim on kind of positivity to negativity compared to yourself? So the dotted line, if you think of that as the midpoint of 5, would be that you value or perceive a victim to be the same as you. Higher scores, you see them as more positive, or lower scores more negative. So it gives somebody an anchor. And this is what we found. So the y-axis is victim derogation. It's been standardised here. And if we look at the absolute measurement scale first, you can see there's no effect here whether participants learn about an injustice via CCTV video or via text. But we get a great effect here for relative measures. So when we're asking people to rate a victim in comparison to themselves, they derogate that victim to a much larger extent when they heard about or experienced the injustice via video rather than text. So this is really supporting that when we are using relative victim derogation measures, the more impactful the stimuli, the greater the victim derogation. So we carried on this work to get to the bottom of why relative versus absolute measures might have an effect, because the effect of impactful stimuli is only here in the relative rather than the absolute measure. So why is that? Why is it the relative measures incite victim derogation, whereas absolute measures do not? So we presented participants with another scenario. This was a text-based scenario, so a low impactful scenario of someone crossing the road. And we're just talking about pedestrian crossings. So then we told participants that it was either a green man allowing the person to walk when they were hit by a car, or it was actually a stop sign when the victim crossed the road and was hit by a car. So in this condition, we have an innocent victim who was doing the right thing, crossing the road at the right time, but was hit by a car. And in this condition, the victim is arguably quite culpable and responsible for their accident because they weren't abiding by the rules of the road. And again, we measured victim derogation by absolute and relative measures. So we asked people to rate the victim, his name was James in this case, on absolute measures or relative measures, very much like the study I was talking about earlier. And this is what we found. So again, we have victim derogation. The non-innocent victim, so when the victim was crossing the road when they shouldn't have done and were injured by a car, there's no real difference in victim derogation between relative or absolute measures. And we'd expect this. We'd expect everybody to devalue this victim and not think very positively of them because they were breaking the rules. And we can see them as non-innocent, i.e. quite a negative person. However, when we have an innocent person, so someone who didn't deserve to be hit by a car, people engage in victim derogation to a greater extent through the relative rather than the absolute measures. So victim derogation occurs to a stronger extent when we're comparing somebody to ourselves rather than putting them on the absolute scale of positivity to negativity. So one reason we thought this might happen is because we know derogating victims isn't socially acceptable. We see that from the bottom the bottom story at the start of the presentation. People don't want to derogate or secondarily victimise victims. It wouldn't be very fair if somebody's suffering and then you as an observer to think negatively of them. So maybe by using these relative measures, what we're doing is actually allowing people to give themselves an anchor and think, well, I think quite highly of myself. This person is just a little bit worse than me or a little bit better than me. Rather than on an absolute scale, there is kind of no anchor. So perhaps using a relative scale, we're able to get around kind of concerns of social desirability. So we measured this in a second study. We first measured people's inclination or motivation to suppress prejudice. So this was an individual difference scale with questions such as, in today's society, it is important that one not be perceived as prejudiced in any manner. So people highly on this scale are likely to want to be quite socially normative, socially desirable, not want to be prejudiced to anyone. We then asked people to read about an instance of suffering. So in this scenario, they read about a woman who contracted an illness in a care home. And then we asked participants to rate this woman victim on absolute as well as relative measures, as in the previous studies. And this is what we found. So at the bottom here, we have this inclination or motivation to suppress prejudice. So either low or high, and derogation again on the y-axis. If you look at the dotted line, the relative measure there, this doesn't change. So people who are motivated to not be prejudiced or have less of that motivation, they don't differ in how they derogate victims. But we do get a difference, we do get fluctuation here when we use the absolute measure. So it seems that people that are quite concerned with not appearing prejudiced and not to suppress prejudiced thoughts and behaviour, they're less likely to agree to absolute measures of victim derogation than those that don't have such a concern. So it seems the absolute measures are more susceptible to social desirability, whereas we don't have any fluctuation with the relative measures, which kind of supports our thinking that relative measures allow us to derogate victims in a reasonably socially desirable way. So what's the take-home message? Well, victim derogation doesn't seem to be an outdated artefact. It is something that people still do today in today's society. It's still one way that people react to victims. But interestingly, they're more likely to do so in emotionally involving situations. So taking people in the lab and asking them to read scenarios, you're probably less likely to get victim derogation comments or attitudes. In real life situations, perhaps you are. Also, it's worthy to note that the way you measure victim derogation may differ, and that's probably hinged on social desirability. So using more relative rather than absolute measures may allow us to get over social desirability bias and measure victim derogation. So I just thought I'll just end off and just talk a little bit of research around victim derogation. And that's firstly talking about, what about if we're talking about ourselves rather than other people? So what about if something bad happens to ourselves? You kind of have two options here, I think. At the first, you can suspend your belief in a just world. You can say something bad's happened to me, I didn't deserve it, so therefore the world isn't a fair and just place. So you can suspend that belief in a just world. Or you can actually think the world is a fair and just place, something bad's happened to me, so therefore I'm a bad person. This one is a little bit worrying because what you're doing here is you're devaluing yourself, you're engaging in victim derogation on yourself, you're lowering your self-esteem and your ego. That goes against a lot of what social psychology says we do. We're very kind of have a self-serving bias a lot of the time. But interestingly, some work has suggested that this is actually the option that people go for when bad events befall them. So I won't go into too much detail. There's a whole body of research around this. There seems to be a bit of a negative spiral here. So when a bad event happens, so for example, participants are in the lab and they draw a bad draw in an experiment, their self-esteem then lowers. So something bad has happened to somebody, so they then see themselves as less of a good person. They actually lower their self-esteem. Because people see themselves as less of a good person with a lowered self-esteem, they actually believe that they deserve bad outcomes. If I'm a bad person, I deserve bad outcomes. And then the next step, which is a bit worrying, is that when people have that belief and have a low self-esteem, they're actually likely to engage in behaviours that incite bad outcomes. So self-handicapping, they show a preference that others see them unfavourably rather than favourably, which is a little bit worrying and leads them to another bad event. So I think this is a really interesting finding because we're actually going against protecting ourselves and our self-esteem and our self-ego to accommodate and uphold that the world is a fair and deserving place. And because something bad happened to me, it was therefore deserved. And I'll just finish off talking about one study that will hopefully put a little bit of a silver line to this arguably quite depressing topic. And that's, is victim derogation the only response? And is it the first response people go to when they're faced with injustice? So in a body of work, we looked at a number of different studies, different manipulations, but we essentially manipulated just one threat. So in one example, participants were told that a young boy was playing at a construction site and was electrocuted. In the threatening just world condition, the victim was innocent and was just playing, there was no signs, but in the non-threatening, the kind of non-innocent victim, there was clear warning signs that the victim ignored and was therefore arguably culpable for their misfortune. We also then wanted to manipulate the mode of responding. So could it be that people are just engaging in victim derogation at quite an intuitive gut level? That's the first response they have to this injustice. When we're giving a bit more time, we might think about responding in a more socially desirable way. So we wanted to really get that intuitive reaction as well as the more rational, thought-out reaction. So we manipulated participants' mode of responding. We did this several different ways. A common way is to put people under time pressure when they're responding to a questionnaire. And that's shown that they respond more intuitively. You haven't got the cognitive capacity to think about your answers compared to when there's no time pressure. We measured victim derogation, but we also measured some other strategies. I haven't got time to go into detail here, but ultimate justice reasoning and victim helping are generally quite positive strategies. They are wanting to help and relieve the suffering of a victim, or ultimate justice reasoning is predicting or foreseeing compensation or less suffering in the future. Victim blame is a bit of a sister to victim derogation, and that's blaming a victim, placing responsibility on a victim. And what we found is that there was no interaction between these two effects and no main effects for thinking style. So generally what that means is it doesn't matter if someone's responding intuitively or rationally. So it doesn't matter if they're under memory load or time pressure, people respond the same way. And the way they respond to both these types of manipulation and over various different scenarios we use is that participants would rather help and compensate a victim, engage in ultimate justice reasoning, rather than victim blame and derogation. So the positive message is that victim derogation isn't our first port of call when we're giving options of different reactions to an injustice, different ways to resolve that injustice. Actually, the more pro-social reactions do seem to be preferred, and we prefer them at a kind of intuitive as well as a rational level. So I think perhaps victim derogation may only happen then when we don't have the choice or the resources or really pushed for that type of reaction. When we have the freedom of choice, people do act in a more pro-social way and do want to help victims to relieve their suffering. So some final thoughts, just to give you a taste of what I'm turning my attention to now. There's been some work that we actually respond differently to different types of victims. So depending on who the victim is, it can pose a different threat to our belief in a just world. So attractive victims threaten our belief in a just world more than unattractive victims and vice versa. So I'm interested in looking at people that perhaps are stigmatised in society And when an event, a bad misfortune or an accident befalls them, do people react differently and engage in these reactions to a different extent, just depending on some unrelated characteristic or social category? The other side of the coin to mention as well is that it's not all bad and it's not all about victims. Belief in just fault theory also goes the other way, and that is seeing deservedness for good events. So if a good event befalls you, you have to be a good person. So what about if a good event befalls a bad person? That equally threatens our belief in a just world, and there's been less research on these types of strategies that we can use to resolve that type of conflict. But I'll leave it there. This isn't just work I do all on my own. I have lots of colleagues and collaborators that help. Some of this research has also been funded. And thank you very much for your time and your patience.
We'll take a few questions now, and obviously we should hopefully, I've not seen sight of it yet, but we should have tea and coffee arriving soon, and we can have some less formal chats over tea and cake. So any questions for Annelie at this stage?
Well, thank you, Annelie.
You're welcome.
Very interesting concepts. From what we know from research in other areas, like, for example, dieting and unsuccessful diet, pretty much this victim derogation and self-blame is actually happening. And I was thinking if you have seen any studies around self-blame or victimized personally, like having the views of derogation around that area, because I think it's quite common in terms of what we find in unsuccessful dieters, basically.
That's really interesting. I guess my short answer is not in that particular field, but very interested to chat about it, and perhaps we could put a study together. But kind of related, there has been some research on people reflecting on illnesses that have happened to them. So people that have had heart attacks or cancer diagnoses. And there seems to be a little bit of research about how people deal with these kind of misfortunes, this bad news. Depends a lot on self-esteem. So if you have low self-esteem, you're more likely to see these bad events as deserved or caused, sometimes by something completely unrelated in your prior life. So a little bit like a karma logic. So I've had a heart attack because I never spoke to my mother when I was younger, that kind of thinking. But interestingly, people with high self-esteem have a bit more of a positive outlook, and they see these illnesses as undeserved, and actually look more to the future and think, I didn't deserve this to befall me, so therefore I deserve some sort of compensation in the future. I'm going to, usually it's kind of, I'm going to have a more fulfilling life, I'm going to grow from this experience, I'm going to be stronger and better. So I've kind of taken your question a little bit away from your original point, but I think there is something to be said about how people conceptualize things that happen to themselves. I think self-esteem might have a really big impact on the way that people see that. And victim derogation, self-blame, definitely is one way to think about it. But I think there's another side of it.
Body image also, isn't it? Negative body image also.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie.
Yes, thanks very much for that. I was interested in recent years. We've seen sort of a rise of victim culture and people assigning victim status to themselves for various different reasons. Would that, I mean, I want to talk about race as well, but is that maybe a factor in changing perception of derogation and that becoming closer to that middle line in your metasode, whereas people are now identifying themselves as victims and therefore got a bit much more merging of this absolute and relative type responses. Have you looked at that?
So to kind of conceptualize your question, you're kind of asking if the way people identify with the kind of concept of being a victim has changed over time.
Yeah, there's more and more identification as victims for various different groups, and you know, I think I'm one without offending anyone, but yeah, there's you know, people are identified as victims in various groups and becoming part of a group or community because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of any kind of research or theory for that, but I think you're probably under the right lines there in terms of being a victim status. There's a lot more support and encouragement and coming forward and all those kind of positive aspects associated with being a victim that maybe wasn't there before. I think that's part of the trend that we were thinking over time. Victim derogation is seen as less social desirable, and being labelled a victim arguably perhaps isn't a negative thing anymore. But in regards to research, I'm not really sure if there's much that's been looked at that in my field at all. It might be a good contributing factor. Thank you.
I was thinking sort of like, what about in different cultures? So like, say in Russia, they've got very different ideas of what victims are to say America, and I was just wondering if there was any study that would, if there are any studies that could compare sort of like the idea of victim derogation. Can't even speak now.
It's been a long day.
It has. Victim derogation almost as a concept, and whether or not they actually believe in a just world, or if there's a little bit more to it, like how much the media actually plays an effect.
Yeah, I think that kind of, your question kind of feeds into my first point there about maybe it depends on who the victims are. I think that varies depending on culture. So one study comes to mind that was conducted in Portugal, and it was actually using the scenario of the little boy that was electrocuted on the construction field. And the participants were told that either the victim was a Portuguese child, so a member of the in-group, or was actually, they labelled the as a gypsy. This was it might have been a traveller in modern terms, but this was seen as a derogated outgroup for that culture at that time. And interestingly, they did find that participants showed less of a threat to their belief in a just world when the victim was a member of the in-group rather than the out-group, even though the injustice was the same. So kind of to answer your point, I do think that depending on the culture, it depends on who in society is seen with high social value or less social value. And I think when something bad happens to someone we hold in high regard rather than low regard, that threatens our belief in just world more than we react more strongly.
Okay.
Sorry if you said this before.
Yeah, that's fine.
Does it link to post-traumatic growth in the victim?
I didn't, and I haven't looked too much in that, but I think you're quite right. So post-traumatic growth is probably close to ultimate justice reasoning, which is something I didn't have time to go into, but it's that belief that acknowledging that you've had an injustice and suffering and it's undeserved, acknowledging that undeservedness, but believing that there will be growth, fulfillment afterwards that will not only make up for that suffering, but perhaps added value. Yeah, moving on. So there was some research that presented participants with, it was a teenager that's injured in a football tournament. And he either just sprained his ankle or had a really bad experience and was in a wheelchair, but then recovered later on in life and went on to live their life. And now participants to think about what that person's life was like in 30 years' time. And what they found is that the person who'd gone through more suffering had a more fulfilling and beneficial life than someone that hadn't. So there seems to be a little bit of personal growth of seeing fulfillment in this ultimate justice reasoning. And that kind of links back to what I was saying earlier about people that when bad things befall them and accidents and illnesses, when you have a high self-esteem, that's the kind of reason you engage in, which is much more positive than self-blame.
Right. Any other burning questions for Annelie at this stage, or we can just have a chat more informally? And I'm still hopeful that tea and coffee will arrive. We're kind of used to it coming early, so I'm a bit, it should still arrive. Okay. In that case, once again, thank you so much.